The little boy was lured into a car by this demon. Hours later, the demon emerged from the woods covered in blood on his mouth and body. A little girl happened to witness this horrifying sight. The next day, police discovered the boy's body lying in the woods. His internal organs had been brutally gnawed. All eyewitness accounts, surveillance footage, and fingerprints pointed to one man, Terry, the elementary school gym teacher. No one expected that this usually gentle and elegant man could turn out to be a murderer. It seemed the case had reached its conclusion, but then came an unexpected twist. Terry claimed that on the day of the crime, he had been attending a conference 100 kilometers away. His lawyer even managed to obtain footage from a local TV station showing Terry present at the conference. This left the police utterly baffled. How could someone be in two different places at the same time? Detective Ralph decided to investigate further and visited the area around the conference venue. A bookstore owner confirmed Terry had indeed been there that day, remembering him vividly because he browsed an obscure book, but didn't purchase it due to its high price. Ralph took the book back to collect fingerprints, and when analyzed, the fingerprints matched those found at the crime scene. Both the police and the district attorney were stunned. Meanwhile, Terry, unable to make bail, was suffering relentless abuse in jail. With no other options, Ralph meticulously re-examined the evidence. He noted that the two eyewitnesses, a child and a nearsighted adult, might not have provided entirely reliable testimony, but the surveillance footage was undeniable. It clearly showed Terry, covered in blood, entering a bar to use the restroom before taking a cab home. It wasn't until he zoomed in on the footage and saw Terry is shown actually giving the middle finger to the camera. This person wanted to be seen on surveillance. But why? As more forensic results came in, the mystery deepened. A few days after the crime, police had recovered clothing and a belt belonging to Terry. On them, they found traces of a strange mucus. Initially believed to be bodily fluids, analysis revealed it wasn't human in origin. Additionally, the fingerprints on the belt were noticeably more smudged than the ones previously analyzed. Such deterioration is typically associated with aging individuals. What could this mean? Unfortunately, time was running out. These discoveries weren't enough to overturn the charges, and the court date arrived quickly. Faced with such inexplicable evidence, how would the judge rule? Terry, however, never lived to find out. Outside the courthouse, a young man suddenly appeared and shot Terry multiple times. Ralph immediately returned fire, killing the assailant. Terry, mortally wounded, collapsed to the ground, weakly repeating,
"I didn't do it. It wasn't me."
He was rushed to the ICU. Amid the chaos, no one noticed a twisted-faced man wearing a green hat, observing the scene coldly from the crowd. That night, Terry's youngest daughter suddenly woke up, terrified. She told her mother she had seen a man who told her that her father had died. A few days later, the girl said to her mother, "Can you bring the policeman investigating Dad's case? That person has something to tell him." To comfort her daughter, her mother, Anna, called Ralph over. The girl told Ralph, "That person wanted me to tell you to stop investigating my dad's case, or something bad will happen." Ralph asked her, "Did he say what kind of bad thing?" This line of questioning angered Anna, who began to lead her daughter away. But Ralph's wife, Mary, stopped her. She insisted the matter should be properly addressed to calm the child, claiming she had experience in such situations. Mary asked the girl what the man looked like. The girl said, "At first, he looked exactly like my dad, but I knew he wasn't my dad. His skin wasn't like Dad's, and he was mean. He wanted to make me cry. The second time he came, he didn't look as much like Dad, and he was dressed really sloppy. The third time, his face was blurry, like someone had wiped it away." Mary reassured the girl, "Now that you've delivered the message, he won't come back anymore." The girl replied, "He's already gone." But that very night, Mary got up for a glass of water and saw a dark shadow in the dining room. Terrified, she dropped her glass, shattering it. Then, as if in a trance, she walked toward the shadow, feeling no pain even as shards of glass cut into her feet. The man leaned close to Mary and whispered, "Tell your husband to stop. If he doesn't, you'll all die." The next morning, Ralph noticed the shattered glass and bloodstains on the floor. Soon after, he saw the wounds on his wife's feet. It struck him as odd that Mary could sleep so soundly despite being hurt, yet Mary seemed distant, clearly unsettled. After some hesitation, she recounted the events of the previous night to Ralph, pleading with him to stop investigating the case. Ralph, however, dismissed her account as sleepwalking. He recalled how Mary had frequently sleepwalked when they were grieving the loss of their son. He encouraged her to take her medication and left to continue his investigation. Meanwhile, Ralph had tracked down a new eyewitness who claimed to have seen the driver of the vehicle involved in the crime. When Ralph asked if the witness could clearly describe the driver's face, the boy hesitated before admitting he couldn't. Still, after much internal struggle, the boy agreed to draw the man's face. Ralph returned home with the boy's sketch, only to find Mary's drawing waiting on the table. The resemblance between the two was shocking. Ralph was left speechless. When Mary came home and saw the comparison, she was equally horrified. Ralph, meanwhile, made another visit to Anna's home. His investigation had led him to believe that the man had started stalking Anna's family during their trip to Dayton a month earlier. He asked Anna if anything unusual had happened during the trip. Anna couldn't think of anything, recalling that they had mostly stayed at the hotel. But her youngest daughter spoke up, saying, "That's not true. Daddy hurt his hand." She explained that after visiting her grandfather, who had Alzheimer's and was staying in a nursing home, her father had come back with a scrape on his wrist. Holly was a near legend in investigative circles, known for her extraordinary sensory perception. She could look at any car on the road and, within 3 seconds, list its make, horsepower, manufacturing year, and other details. A glance at a building was enough for her to estimate its height, with an error margin of less than 6.6 centimeters. But her most remarkable skill was her sixth sense. By standing at a crime scene, Holly could mentally reconstruct what had happened, guiding her investigations with uncanny accuracy. With hopes pinned on her abilities, Holly was brought to Dayton. When Holly arrived in Dayton, a month had already passed since the incident. She wanted to check the surveillance footage, but it had long been erased. Unbothered, she proceeded to a nursing home, intending to speak with Terry's father. However, when Holly asked a few extra questions, the staff grew suspicious and threw her out, saying only Terry himself could visit his father. The staff assumed Holly was a reporter. Her sharp intuition told her they were hiding a scandal, but it likely wasn't related to Terry's case. Holly was undeterred. She tracked down the nursing home staff member after her shift. The encounter didn't go as planned. Mistaking Holly for a stalker, the woman pepper-sprayed her in the face. Once the misunderstanding was cleared up, the woman invited Holly back to her home and shared what she knew about Walter. She explained that Walter had shown up at the nursing home on his day off, acting strangely quiet and unlike himself. Walter had been assigned to care for Terry's father. Coincidentally, Terry had also visited the nursing home that day. It was clear now. Terry's wrist wound had come from Walter, but the woman was just as perplexed about what happened next. Walter committed the gruesome murder of the Williams sisters shortly afterward. Yet Walter's mother adamantly claimed that Walter had never left her side during that time. Holly was now almost certain of the connection between Terry's case and Walter's. Was the critical moment really when Terry's hand was scratched? Could something be passed on through such a wound? Holly eventually managed to speak to Terry's father, but his severe dementia rendered him incoherent and unhelpful. This forced Holly to focus back on Walter's history. If Walter had passed this thing to Terry, then who had infected Walter? Holly returned to the staff member's home and pressed her for more information. She finally learned that Walter had recently vacationed in New York. Digging further, Holly found a postcard from the trip and immediately investigated. Sure enough, during Walter's stay in New York, another murder had occurred. This time, however, the killer was a woman, not a man. Holly quickly headed to New York to investigate. In prison, she met the female killer, a former hotel receptionist. The woman vaguely recognized Walter's photo, recalling that he had persistently pursued her romantically. She didn't like Walter and even stood him up on a date. But what she didn't realize was that another version of herself had gone on that date instead. That version had breakfast with Walter, returned to the hotel room with him, and during the encounter had scratched Walter's back with her fingernails. Holly asked the prisoner, "Do you know who the real culprit is?" The woman hesitated, then said, "If I told the police, they'd lock me in a mental institution." Before Holly could press further, visiting hours ended, and the prisoner had to leave. As Holly sat pondering this revelation, a mysterious woman at the next table slipped her a note. Holly arrived at the home of the mysterious woman who, at first glance, seemed eccentric, like a self-proclaimed mystic. The woman got straight to the point, asking Holly, "When you were a child, what did your parents say to scare you into going to sleep?" Caught off guard, Holly asked incredulously, "Are you saying you know about the sleep demon?" The woman nodded, explaining, "Sleep demon, sleep spirit, whatever name you've heard. Parents say things like, if you don't sleep, the sleep demon will come and eat you. What they don't realize is that by believing in it, they make it real. But this being has a more fitting name, the Wound Eater." She went normal. Later, Holly scoured legends and folk tales, finding unsettling correlations that explained many of the case's mysteries. However, Her challenge was how to present these findings to the police without sounding insane. As she wandered through a cemetery searching for further clues, a boy caught her attention. In their brief conversation, the boy appeared to be confessing his guilt over the deaths of the Williams sisters. Before Holly could dig deeper, he hurried away. She managed to snap a few photos of him. The next day, as Holly prepared to leave, she stumbled upon the same boy attempting to shoot a man. The boy hesitated for a long time, delaying his actions until the police arrived. Then, suddenly, he turned the gun on the officers, firing, only to be gunned down instantly. It was later discovered that the boy's gun had been empty the whole time. He had staged the incident as a form of suicide. What kind of despair drives someone to orchestrate their own death at the hands of others? Holly couldn't understand it. But she noticed something peculiar. The back of the boy's neck was covered in blisters. During the investigation of a murder at a barn, specifically the second crime scene, George had seen something unclean. Inside the barn, a shadowy figure had appeared before him.
What do you want?
Returning home, George examined his neck in a mirror, noticing the disturbing blisters for the first time. From that moment on, George became like a servant. Every day he had to hunt and leave deer or other animals in the woods. Their carcasses would soon be devoured. George felt like he was providing for an invisible master. Worse still, the entity spent George's money lavishly. George would buy furniture and deliver it to the woods, yet his master would still punish him when displeased, beating him mercilessly. Despite his misery, George felt powerless to break free. Recently, he had been tasked with a new mission, to kill a woman named Holly. But after learning more about Holly, George decided to spare her, hoping she might hold the key to his salvation. He accompanied Holly to the station, eager to hear her findings during the briefing. In the precinct's conference room, the officers were eager to hear Holly's report. But Holly was visibly nervous. What she was about to say would be met with disbelief and could brand her as delusional. Taking a deep breath, Holly began. There are 3 interconnected cases. First, there's Terry. He went to Dayton 24 days ago where he was scratched by another killer, Walter. Walter, 23 days ago, had been in New York where he met a girl. That girl committed a murder the same day. All 3 cases share 2 key details: DNA and fingerprints left at the scene, and at the same time, witnesses and video evidence proving the suspects had alibis miles away from the crime scenes. In other words, each of them had a doppelganger. Holly paused before continuing. And the intervals, 23 or 24 days, are no coincidence. It's part of a fixed cycle. The demon spreads through wounds, taking about 24 days to fully mature. When the time comes, committing murder seems almost inevitable for the host. The officers in the room were visibly puzzled. Holly had explained so much. But one question remained. What exactly is this demon? Holly took a deep breath before continuing. Different cultures have given it different names: shapeshifter, parasite, or doppelganger. In America, parents often call it the sleep demon. The room fell silent. Everyone was stunned. Many of them recalled how, as children, their parents would warn, "If you don't sleep, the sleep demon will come and take you away." But that was just a myth. Or so they thought. Groups split, some choosing to believe Holly's explanation, others dismissing it outright. Mary, however, was deeply convinced. She approached Holly to ask more questions. But behind her, George suddenly felt a loud buzzing in his head. His vision blurred, and when he looked at his hands, words began appearing on his skin, as if written by an unseen force. When George returned home that evening, his deceased mother appeared before him, glaring furiously. Without a word, she began beating him. This was the demon's punishment for George's disobedience. The physical pain was excruciating, but the emotional despair of seeing his mother in such a monstrous state was far worse. George broke. His will to resist shattered. That night, George made a decision. He would fully obey the demon. First thing in the morning, he would find Holly and carry out his assigned mission. Meanwhile, Holly, unaware of George's intentions, had been invited by Mary to stay at her house for the night. During the day, Ralph, the most skeptical member of the group, was still unconvinced by Holly's claims about supernatural forces. To persuade him, Holly asked Mary for some clear tape and colored markers. She applied the colored tape over the camera lens of her phone, turned on the flashlight feature, and directed it at the dining table and chairs. To everyone's shock, an area on the table glowed faintly. "This is residual material left by the demon," Holly explained. "It's the same substance the police found at the barn." Ralph, though still skeptical, muttered that further lab tests would be needed. But in secret, he began investigating Terry's next possible victim. Reviewing footage from a local bar, Ralph spotted Terry briefly grabbing the hand of a man with a long face. Elsewhere, George had successfully lured Holly into his car under the pretense of revisiting the barn. During the ride, Holly noticed the blisters on George's neck and became increasingly uneasy. Her unease grew when she spotted the handgun on George's belt. Sensing the danger, Holly asked to stop for a restroom break, intending to escape. However, the bathroom window was fixed and couldn't be opened. Worse still, George, suspecting something, had followed her inside. Earlier that morning, George had woken up on the floor, disoriented. He had called Holly, telling her about the strange occurrences at the barn and suggesting she accompany him to investigate. Holly, eager for more clues, had quickly agreed. What she didn't know was that George had already loaded his gun with bullets. Meanwhile, Ralph, realizing Holly was missing, repeatedly tried calling her phone but got no response. When he learned from colleagues that Holly had recently been spending time with George, he tried calling George's number as well, only to be met with silence. Growing concerned, Ralph and the others decided to visit George's home. What they found inside left them horrified. The walls were covered in blood, smeared and splattered in an almost chaotic pattern. Though they couldn't confirm whether the blood belonged to Holly, the scene was enough to prompt immediate action. In the car, George went straight to the point, asking Holly why the demon had chosen him. George had been paying the closest attention to Holly's briefing the previous day, so he now fully understood what was happening to him. Holly, knowing she needed to tread carefully, explained, "The demon is attracted to pain. The more sorrow and despair a person carries, the more irresistible they become." She tried to reassure George, promising to find a solution. But she was also secretly plotting an escape. When Holly pretended she needed to use the restroom,
Tell me.
I have my period.
she quickly rummaged through her bag, confirming her spare keys were still there. She tried climbing out through the bathroom window, but it was far too sturdy. Meanwhile, George, growing impatient, quietly stepped out of the car and approached the restroom. Suddenly, he heard the sound of shattering glass. George retreated to the woods, intending to end his own life. Yet every time he tried to pull the trigger, the demon's influence stopped him. Holly, meanwhile, didn't blame George. She understood that he was enduring a fate worse than death. Later, Holly told the group, "I always thought that thing only fed on children, but I missed something important. The demon also needs to feed during its transformation stages. And George, he became its weapon," she explained further. George had just lost his wife. That made him vulnerable. His despair was the perfect doorway for the demon, and his skills as a marksman, perfect for serving as the demon's killer. Shortly after, a photo surfaced that caused a massive uproar. Ralph, who had always doubted Holly, had hidden surveillance footage of Terry scratching the hand of a man with a long face. When Mary found out, she and Holly furiously berated Ralph. After a heated discussion, the group decided to track down the long-faced man. However, they soon learned that he had quit his job at the bar due to not feeling right and had returned to his hometown. This decision, they suspected, had been influenced by the demon's growing control over him. The man, whose name was Paul, had recently been arrested after being pulled over for driving unshaven. His younger brother, furious at what he considered unjust treatment, stormed into the police station, shouting at the officers. When officers from another city arrived, the truth was revealed. "We did this to protect Paul," the officers explained. "In 2 days, his doppelganger could appear and commit a murder. If that happens, all the blame will fall on Paul." When asked how he was feeling, Paul broke down in tears. Finally, someone was willing to listen to him. "I feel like I'm being watched," he sobbed. "Every corner, every shadow, there's always something there staring at me, and I don't feel like myself anymore. I've changed, and I don't even recognize who I am." Ralph and the others decided to stay at Paul's house, ostensibly to protect him, but also to observe whether another Paul would emerge. Despite their growing conviction, everything remained speculation until that point. They kept a close eye on the news, waiting for signs of the demon's next move. The next day, however, the police showed up at Paul's door to arrest him. Confused, the group demanded an explanation. The officers revealed that a masked man wearing a dog face mask had been spotted at a nearby tourist site. The man had lured a young boy by claiming there were saber-toothed tiger footprints in a nearby cave. Excited, the boy eagerly followed. Luckily, the boy's sister recognized him even with the mask on and immediately realized something was wrong. She screamed for help. alerting others in the area. The masked man was quickly tackled by the boy's grandfather, but in the ensuing chaos, he managed to escape. Photos of the incident, however, showed the man's unmasked face, and it was unmistakably Paul's. This revelation finally shattered Ralph's skepticism. He now fully believed Holly. The demon is real, he admitted. Thanks to Ralph and the other police officers providing an alibi, Paul was spared from being taken into custody. Ralph's team later visited the young boy who had encountered the masked man. From his description, they were able to gather details about the cave the demon was headed to. Based on these features, Paul's younger brother, familiar with the local terrain, was able to pinpoint the exact location. The group decided to head there to capture the demon. However, Holly, understanding the demon's ability to share sensory connections with Paul, made a critical decision. She arranged for a lawyer to take Paul out of town, ensuring the demon would remain unaware of their plan. But things didn't go smoothly. Paul's younger brother, perhaps underestimating the gravity of the situation, thought it would be prudent to update Paul about their plan and warn him to be cautious. The moment he shared the details, Paul exploded in anger. "Are you stupid? That thing is in my head. Telling me this will get them all killed." Realizing his mistake, the brother panicked. The lawyer immediately tried to call the group to warn them, but with no cell signal in the mountains, the call didn't go through. With no other choice, the lawyer and Paul's brother jumped into a car, racing to catch up with the group. By this time, George was already in position, his rifle aimed and ready. When the group arrived at the mountain and stepped out of the car, George, hidden at a distance, fired his first shot. A bearded man in the group dropped dead instantly. Chaos erupted. The group scrambled for cover, unable to return fire. Despite being trained police officers, none of them dared to retaliate because their attacker was George, one of their own and the department's best marksmen. George, drunk on rage and adrenaline, continued to fire, shooting the bearded man's lifeless body several more times. Then, unexpectedly, backup arrived. But they had no idea what they were walking into. A truck pulled up, and a cowboy-like man jumped out. Amidst the chaos, Roger, Holly's boyfriend, made a decision. Concerned for Holly's safety and realizing the dire situation, Roger approached a car and climbed in. Keeping his head low, he fumbled with the keys, knowing he had to get to an area with signal to call for reinforcements. At that moment, a rattlesnake slithered out from the nearby underbrush, coiling and locking its unblinking eyes on George.
Kill it.
They ventured into the cave, the air thick with the stench of decay. Finally, they saw it, the demon. It turned to face them, and their blood ran cold. It looked exactly like Paul. The creature let out a guttural roar, so loud that chunks of dirt and debris fell from the cave ceiling. Its expression was unnervingly calm as it spoke to Ralph. "Shoot me, and everyone here will die." Holly, still trembling with rage, stepped forward and demanded, "Why are you doing this? Why hurt so many people?" The demon sneered. "Why? The same reason you eat meat. I need to feed. I need to live." Ralph couldn't take it anymore. He surged forward, fists clenched, ready to beat the demon to death with his bare hands. But Holly held him back. "Don't! Its body is toxic!" Just then, Paul entered the cave. When he saw the demon, his exact duplicate, his stomach turned. When the dust finally settled, the demon lay motionless on the ground. Holly and Paul, supporting each other, began to make their way out of the cave. But suddenly, Ralph froze. In front of him stood two ghostly figures, blocking his path. He immediately stopped in his tracks, realizing that the demon was not fully dead. He had become the next George. For a split second, Ralph seemed to understand the creature on a profound level. He faced the demon and spoke with chilling clarity. "I know your heart is not your weak spot. It's your brain. I also know you're weak now, so your control is fading." The demon's eyes flickered open. It stopped pretending to be dead, its form shifting rapidly. It morphed into every person in the room. But with the demon's body destroyed, there was no evidence left to explain what had happened, leaving Ralph with a dilemma. How would they ever convince the world of the truth? He quickly devised a plan. Ralph instructed the others to fabricate a story. The bearded man and Paul both received anonymous calls, leading them to the forest. This, they explained, was the reason they had all gone into the woods. As for why the anonymous calls had come, Paul had previously confided in the bearded man that he had seen someone who resembled Terry, and he suspected the true killer might not be Terry at all. This suspicion was overheard by George, who was under the demon's control. George and the demon, taking advantage of the situation, began plotting the anonymous phone call to mislead the group. They fabricated a tip about a mysterious figure, guiding the bearded man and Paul to the woods, where the gunfight unfolded. This explanation cleared up all the details. But more importantly, it helped exonerate Terry. With no one left to corroborate George and the bearded man's version of events, their story was as good as dead. All that remained was for Paul to lie convincingly, and the entire narrative would be wrapped up.